power, and Ukrainians revolted against him. They overthrew his government, and he fled, naturally, to Moscow, where he remains in exile today under the protection of Vladimir Putin's government. So Yanukovych got ousted. The new government that took over thereafter came to power in these really dramatic circumstances, right? Amid these massive protests in the streets and the shifting and uncertain loyalties of the police and the military. And the new government ended up taking over the running of that country in dramatic circumstances. It's no small matter to take over running a country when it had previously been run by a Putin-supporting dictator, and you're a country that has a very big, long border with Russia. The new government, in fact, also took over what would soon be a war with Russia. But at the same time, amid all that, the new government also decided that it was a priority for them to come to terms with what had happened under the previous regime, with what had happened under the dictator who they deposed. They decided that one of their priorities as a new government would be to understand, to grapple with the looting, the corruption, the wholesale cheating and theft of state assets, which had all happened under Manafort's guy. And of course, you remember the sort of scary and amazing footage of the long uprising that ultimately ousted Manafort's guy. But the images from that time that I have found even more indelible since that all happened is the footage not just from the uprising, but the footage we got from the aftermath. After Manafort's guy, after Yanukovych fled to Russia. Because the aftermath footage was very moving, I think, in a civic-minded sense. We ended up with this footage of Ukrainians, regular people, by the thousands, streaming into the properties and the palaces that Viktor Yanukovych had kept locked up in secret while he was in power, so that the people of his country couldn't see what he was stealing. After he was gone, after he fled to Russia, the Ukrainian people opened up the gates and went in to see for themselves. And they were not there to loot the place, which you might expect in those circumstances. They went in instead to find out and document what this guy had done with their country's wealth. And that's how we learned about his private zoo and his antique car museum and his gold-plated golf clubs. Does that even make for good golfing? That's how we learned he had a fake Spanish galleon floating restaurant just for himself. You know, and there's something amazing about the footage of regular people trying to figure out what all this stuff is and what to make of the fact that, yeah, he really did have a gold toilet. But look at the creepy gold toilet feet. Look at that. Why does a toilet need feet at all? Why do they have to be gold? But it's fascinating to see regular people just taking this in, realizing, oh, wow, this is what he'd been stealing all of our money for, was to build himself a place like this with stuff like this. And the Ukrainian people did not tear the place apart. They didn't loot it. They opened it up to show everyone, and they invited in news crews so the world could see what this guy had done. And then they took it further. They dove into his private lake that he'd had dug for his private floating restaurant. And they pulled out the papers that had been sunk there. They poked through the fireplaces and the ash piles to collect the shreds of documents that Manafort's guy had decided to try to destroy before he fled in the dead of night back to Russia. They salvaged all the documents they could to try to piece them all back together. Look at the torn and burnt shreds of documents. They're laying them out to dry to try to piece them back together so they can tell the truth about this corrupt, pro-Putin kleptocracy that they had just risen up as a people against and end it. And, you know, things in Ukraine have not worked out perfectly. They've not necessarily worked out great. Change is hard. But in that moment, that human endeavor to try to make sure the truth did not get disappeared, that moment where they decided, you know what? People need to know. This needs to be preserved for historical accuracy. There has to be accountability for what happened here. We can't just let this all go. It was moving, right? It was just as a sober, constructive, practical example of how to love your country in difficult times. It was moving. Well, as part of that effort, the new government that took over in Ukraine after this guy was run out of the country and fled back to Moscow, they established a new job in the new government. They established a special prosecutor to make use of all that salvaged documentation, to piece it all together, to make sure that the people who did what they did didn't get away with it. They established a special prosecutor to investigate and pursue criminal charges against anybody who was part of the corruption and the selling out of that country under Manafort's guy, under Yanukovych. Well, amid the 3,000 or so cases that were eventually opened by that anti-corruption prosecutor. 4 of those cases were about Trump campaign chairman Paul Manafort.